And it's February the 8th, and we're in London, and I'm having, I think it's my third conversation with Lord Thurlow in his flat here in Maida Vale. And for those of you who don't know, Francis has had extraordinary global experience of the affairs, international affairs, for some considerable time, and has only recently retired from the House of Lords. And his experience of events which have contributed to the shaping of our modern world is really extraordinary, and I hope he will talk about some of his personal experiences during this discourse. But I thought, Francis, today that we look at this whole question, which is an agonizing one, I think, for many of us. How can we make a difference? How can changes be made in the affairs of people, internationally or even on a smaller scale? How can something be improved in the way in which people live their lives? How can some of these difficult conflicts and violence be cured or healed? And all these sorts of questions in which sometimes we as individuals may feel very much impotent or unable to make any kind of contribution or change. So I want to start with you as just floating the idea there may be all kinds of ways, in fact, in which this state of mankind can be influenced, and even influenced by a single individual, or at least some events can be shaped by it. So I wonder if you can talk about the sort of experiences you've had of that.
Well, on the general proposition, I have no doubt whatever that in spite of the apparent large-scale set of effects in which big happenings have to have big planning and beginnings and follow through, that, I mean, this is a highly oversimplified picture, and things in the ordinary world don't work like that at all. And I have, as you say, although I didn't entirely recognize your picture of my life, I have been immersed in public affairs for a very long time, and have therefore had first-hand experience of how, in fact, things do happen in the international scene, and to a lesser extent in my experience in the domestic affairs of the country. And of course, having been a professional, I naturally am prejudiced in favor of rational processes in seeking to have some kind of rational influence on the outcome of events. And so I do place a very great premium on the processes of preparation and background work that underlies the eventual expression of policy. And we unfortunately live, of course, in an age in which the media reigns supreme, and politicians, to a greater or less extent, but I regretfully, in recent years, to a greater extent, are always looking over their shoulder at what the media is going to say next and what it said yesterday.
Yes.
And so the influence of the media, which is a very, of course, shallow one, has become quite disproportionate. And the effect of that on the influence of the people behind the scenes who try to supply their ministers and senior spokesmen with briefs based on very careful analysis and really deep understanding of the historical processes behind any actual situation. I mean, the influence of these people has been enormously diminished. And this is a very difficult and dangerous process.
Well, if I just summarize or reflect back to you part of what you say, what I pick out of it is an image that our language, the present moment of people is shrinking. So they're beginning to think in terms of perhaps just the period until the next election,
Quite.
instead of decades. And if you're in that kind of world, you just don't do certain things in the narrower world, because they're not real in that narrower world at all.
Well, I think it is really a disaster that we have all saddled ourselves, those of us who live in countries that profess to have democratic or parliamentary government, with constitutions in which everything is dominated, as you say, by the timing between elections. And so the people who are in the field and whose future depends on the outcome of elections, when the chips are down, will subordinate, unfortunately, almost everything now to considerations of what is going to influence the next election. So there's only a short honeymoon period after an election in any country
Right.
when the so-called statesmen, where there are such things,
Left anymore.
and have a measure of freedom. And as we were talking recently, I mean, that we all live now on the edge of chaos. We live in a world which outwardly has all the attributes of chaos. And same time, we've been brought up to think that we ought to try to see that as far as possible everything is done in a sensible way.
Absolutely, it's a total contradiction in
And,
the state of mind.
And so, for better or for worse, we all live in this new area of the boundary of chaos.
About the having, say, groups of, call it professional people, as a neutral term, who have a larger time scale, would you think that in some way this is being sought for and worked at by people who belong in a way to industry, to commerce and to business, but only partly? I mean, there's a whole category of organization called NGO, non-governmental organizations, which are in some degree voluntary, some degree connected with business but not ruled by them, and they're in fact quite a widespread and numerous corpus of such organizations in the world now, who can have, or at least set themselves a brief of a bigger time scale. I think one of the examples in mind was, of course, the Club of Rome, which attempted to educate the public in the possible ecological disasters facing mankind.
Well, I agree. I think that the NGOs now have fortunately levered themselves into a position of considerable political influence. And they are collectively a very important lobby. And some of them are well run. I mean, there's a scale of competence and incompetence, especially in international NGOs. International things under the auspices of the United Nations are subject to the malign domination of having to give every member country a fair whack of the jobs. And this is reflected in NGOs, of course. And so you can't recruit on the basis of, entirely on the basis of merit. And as we've seen in powerful illustrations such as the Food and Agriculture Organization, it can get into disastrous hands of totally corrupt tyrant who organizes everything in a way that ensures that his own, when it comes to the end of his term, that he'll be reappointed, and surrounds himself with cronies and this kind of thing.
Yeah, that cronyism.
Well, I mean, that's
it happens.
A fairly extreme case.
But I'm thinking an example of my friend in Brussels, Anthony Judge, who services the Union of International Associations, which was completely self-financing, and has produced this wonderful encyclopedia of world problems and human potential. And you get the sense of the importance, of the possible importance of such organizations, which are at least putting the picture together, putting this information together in a way which is not beholden to industrial or political interests. And I think for me, it's one of the examples of somebody doing, a group of people just holding enough information, building it enough to have a basis for this extended present moment, because they're able to look at things in terms of 100 years or something like that.
Well, I think this is a very encouraging trend, and incidentally is a great help to the professionals in foreign offices, because at the pace of events now, it's extremely difficult for the chaps on the job to keep up with the quality of their briefing. And so it is a great help if you get a properly digested and presented tidy statement of a rational case for that you can submit with your advice to your minister. I think that though it has to be boiled down to 2 sentences because nobody has time to read anything more.
Yeah.
And but still, I mean, and that is a healthy development, which I think contributes very much to effective accountability and democracy, because after all, some of them do represent a certain amount of voting influence, or potentially so. And this wasn't nearly as strong, of course, in the days when I was active in the international field, but I welcome it. Just as I deplore the speed of change and the wretched people on the job having to stay in the same place and never having time really to catch up.
We put in my association with Francis are going towards history in terms of hundreds of years and going back even to the Royal Society of London, and the role played by these independent organizations of, let's use the phrase, of learned beings who just devote themselves to research as for their own interest, but also as a public service. And it's interesting with the Royal Society because, of course, it was independent of the then entrenched bastions of academic power, Oxford and Cambridge. It was situated here in London, in touch with practical people, had a little edge of political radicalism in it and so on, and therefore had all the characteristics of this sort of group, because there have been groups associated with religion, such as Priestley was involved in, Faraday. A lot of major scientists have always been connected with religious movements, and spiritual movements. So there might be, in fact, a complex history which I've never seen actually comprehensively described, of these independent bodies sort of truly self-organizing, concerned with learning and with creating a new vision, which come and go, and they might be in science, they might be in industry, they might be in the arts, they might be in religion, they might be in the judiciary, but in a sense I've always felt that something like them has always existed in the fabric of society. And
of course, latterly there's been this new manifestation of the same social phenomenon in the growth of networking,
yes,
and which, compared to organized societies, is much more informal and operates quicker and
quicker. That's right.
And but I mean, this is one of the main encouraging characteristics of the time we live in. I think that networking is becoming the name of the game. And but apropos the influence of organized societies, of course, in this country, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, that is to say Chatham House as it's known as, has exercised an extremely powerful influence on the formulation of foreign policy in this country for the last 50 years, and continues to do so. with absolutely first-rate stuff pouring out from it to those who are fortunate enough to be members, and providing a forum for people to talk about subjects with experts, with people who are playing the game in the field. And the same, of course, in Washington, and to some extent more so, because as power now, world power now lies in Washington, this evokes its reflection in responsible, voluntary work, because people feel it's worthwhile, that you can actually exercise semi-direct influence on what happens if you are near the throne in Washington.
Yes, yes. You have to have these personal incentives.
And so,
to get into
I
it.
mean, things like foreign affairs, I mean, serious journals like that, I think, potentially exercise an enormous influence, and certain particular articles, of course, have become almost biblical text in the history of international affairs.
Because just now you were talking about the media and the state of the media, but I've seen time and time again, it's as if the media concerns itself with an extraordinarily narrow band of what's actually happening. And there are always quite alternative means of communication and organization and work being done and even actual events happening which are not reflected in the media at all. And you always feel if something's got into the newspapers, it's already corrupt or damaged. And you pray to God what you're doing doesn't ever get into the newspapers. Because it's literally like two different worlds, I feel. What is on in the newspaper, on television, and what creative people are actually doing seems to me to be worlds apart.
In a way, I suppose one can say that it's fortunate that the daily press is to some extent working out its own destruction as an influence.
Yes, yes.
And it's becoming so much a vehicle of amusement and not of communication of information, interesting information, that people are ceasing to bother about it. And luckily there are one or two notable exceptions, and I'm quite interested in this country. I mean, the New York Times is so much better than anything there is here in the daily press, with possible exception of Financial Times, which of course is specialized. And so maybe we shall all take in the New York Times in future.
Oh dear, what a coming down.
But that reflects where the power is, of course.
Yes, it does. It does go with power.
Yeah.
But I just like this prospect, as I say, that in the way the media serves because it provides a cover over what's really going on, because you don't want lots of people superficially to know what's really going on, because it becomes disruptive. Because it has to be, there are certain things to be developed, so to speak, in quiet, or with an audience which shares in a certain level of knowledge about something, as the examples you were giving were saying. You don't want them to be too democratic, because it would dilute the process and the fruit would not be produced.
Well, of course, it gets one into rather deep water when one starts considering the state of so-called democracy that we've now been arrived at as a result of 100 years of progressively lowering the age of voting and increasing the range of the franchise, so that the mass of the voting population is extraordinarily ignorant, has extremely shallow interests, and focuses almost entirely on its own private interests, and so ceases really to be a suitable party to which accountability should be made. And this really erodes the whole concept of democracy. And one looks back to the very short periods when there has been such a thing as a healthily working accountable democracy, with really rather well-educated people running the show.
Which was when?
Well, I suppose the Victorian era was one of those periods when it wasn't really democracy, it was still the survival of aristocracy. Aristocracy in the sense of comprising the tops of the upper levels of the industrial world as well.
Yes, it was changing very much.
Industrial and financial world. But anyway, I mean, very responsible people being in the very responsible jobs. And with the electorate, still a relatively educated electorate, and we no longer have that, of course. And I don't think people are bothering much about this because they see no way out. And
So it's,
means that Parliament, of course, is being sidelined, as we know in this country.
yes,
And
yes. It's just a show.
yeah,
It's a showpiece. Well, I mean, it's sort of incredible. I mean, as you know better than I, many complex issues. You going back to Victorian times, the shift from the aristocracy proper to these new capitalist enterprises, and the fact there was an enormous, actually oppressed underclass in the Victorian times, which was living in abominable conditions.
yeah,
And the impetus which then came to have this with franchise, the impetus to education, the unfortunate thing that education became more and more state-controlled, and we now see the last wretchednesses of that.
reductio ad absurdum.
Absolutely, yes. It is such an insult to our children, what is happening now. But I wonder whether, in fact, we give these labels of democracy and franchise and so on, but in fact there always operates much greater diversity of influence, and even if we speak crudely in terms of who's running the show, in fact it's not the population at large which is running the show.
Quite,
at all, isn't it? Because you always have the professionals.
Yes.
And they have power and they command resources because of their ability.
Yes, and at the superior political level, of course, what counts is experience. And when a government has been in power, or party in power, for considerable time, you do get quite a measure of experience at last. And we've been going through both, after all, in this country and in the United States, some periods in which, after change, I mean, there's been a period in which there's hardly any experience at all to draw on at the top, and vast, massive mistakes are made, and everything is done in a very hasty and ill-considered way. But one gets through that. I mean, if the power remains placed in the same area for over 5 years, I think. It takes at least 5 years.
Yes. Yeah. It's simply then almost a natural process of learning will take place. I
mean, I saw one of the comparatively recent examples of this when I was serving as acting High Commissioner in Canada, just very shortly after the Conservative government had been brought back into office after 26 years. And they'd been kept out by the Canadian Liberals, thanks to the extraordinary ingenuity and cleverness and craft of Mr. Mackenzie King, who was a very remarkable Prime Minister for 20x years.
Gosh.
And they came back, and of course they never had any responsibility, and they floundered about, and everything was done off the cuff. And they couldn't work with our civil servants because they thought they were all quislings because they'd been working with our predecessors. And so it was really a shambles. And here was I trying to get sensible decisions out of this government on matters in which we had an interest. And I got into rather disgrace with my very close friends who ran the Canadian Foreign Office, because on one occasion I had a telegram in the middle of the night saying that it was of vital importance to get the Canadian agreement to our sending aircraft into Jordan to prevent some blow-up with Iraq. And there was no possibility of getting an early United Nations sanction for this. It was all very urgent.
Yeah.
And the Canadians, for many years after the last war, had become one of the main champions of things being sanctified by the United Nations, which was a good cause in theory, and it takes time. And so behind the backs of my friends in the Foreign Office, I got the Prime Minister out of bed at half past 5 or 6 in the morning.
Charming.
And went and got exactly what I wanted out of him, because he had no advice. and of course, they quite legitimately were extremely annoyed with me, because it was not the way to behave. It's but anyway, it got its results.
Yes, you do that sort of thing. And we've been talking largely around, let me call it the sort of professional bodies and organizations and centers of learning in a sense. I wondered about the more intimate level in this, because I was so impressed by, and you might care to tell this story of how, let's say, good manners between two people at one critical time can make an enormous difference.
Well, I mean, that was an illustration of the butterfly effect in international affairs and domestic affairs. That apparently, I know no weather science, but apparently the flapping of a butterfly's wings over the Pacific results in a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. And as an illustration of the butterfly effect in domestic and international affairs, I've found myself, for my sins, right at the center of the storm in Nigeria when parliamentary government broke down in Nigeria only 4 years after independence, when the independent Nigeria had been born with an extremely good parliamentary government within the limits of the possible, and a very sagacious prime minister. And they were killed off, including the prime minister, and the first military government took over and behaved with extreme unwisdom to the people they thought they could push around and tried to push around, and inspired such irritation and fury that they were killed off in their turn after 6 months. And I was woken early in the morning, about 5 o'clock, and told that the military government had been killed off and fighting was going on still, but it was clear that a new northern-based government had come into power. And I asked who the head of the government was, and was told that it was a comparatively young colonel, Colonel Gowan, who was the new head of the military government. And I said, oh, well, I'll come into my office my usual time, in 4 hours' time or something. But the name of Gowan rings a bell in my mind. And I reflected a little, and I remembered that he was one of the innumerable people who we used to entertain at dinner. And I couldn't remember his face, but I did remember him and his name, because he had written an extremely graceful and charmingly expressed letter of thanks after being at our house for the evening, which was a very unusual thing in itself, and be done very nicely too. And so, on the basis of this recollection, I told my staff, asked my staff to, soon after I got to my office at the usual time, to try and get Colonel Gowan on the telephone, wherever he might be, which they duly succeeded in doing, and the fighting was still going on, and he was at his military headquarters. But I had also, when I asked my staff if we knew at all what the policy of the new government was. I was told that because the previous government had so insulted the northern emirs, who were powerful people in their own land, the sub-Sahara region of Nigeria, and who commanded the majority of the population of Nigeria, that they had decided they'd never put themselves in the position of being pushed around by the what they regarded as the alien tribes of the south. And so they were going to split Nigeria up into 3 countries. Well, once you start splitting up the redrawing the boundaries of former colonial Africa, it's very difficult to see where the process will end, and the intervening period would be likely to be one of even greater chaos than Africa has descended into. And so I felt that it was really a very undesirable thing to start breaking up Nigeria just because the emirs felt they'd been insulted. I mean, it's not a very good reason for changing frontiers. And so we talked for 20 minutes on the open telephone with shooting going on outside. And when I was trying to suggest to the new head of the government that this idea wasn't, he said, how do you know that this is our policy? And he didn't let on that it was, of course, but in fact, my intelligence staff had discovered this, and so I just said a little bird had told me, and I arranged. He said, I can't change the policies that I have been put in this position to carry out. And I said, well, I think I can help you on that. And anyway, to cut a long story short, I went and had 3 hours with him next day, and we worked out a plan, and I said I would provide ammunition from London and Washington with the help of my American colleague.
I mean, it was sort of diplomatic ammunition.
Yes, I drafted a whole lot of messages, which I and my very close friend, the American ambassador, fired off, and we got my messages back, duly authorized as coming from the prime ministers and foreign secretary and secretary of state and so on, and we bounced them into it, and it all worked out. And so the reason why there's a country called Nigeria now as still the greatest potential stabilizing make-weight in Black Africa, with its 100 million plus population, balanced resources and so on, if it can only hang together and if it can only sustain some kind of accountable government, as it has again now managed to have in the last 2 years. And there are a lot of ifs in all this, and the reason why this powerful stabilizing influence would be there would be because Colonel Gowan had written a nice letter of thanks to my wife. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been in a position to ring him up and talk as if he was a friend.
Yes, it's extraordinary that.
But it's the butterfly effect.
Yes, it's a staggering example of it. I was wondering about any, in a sense, counter-examples, which I have to appeal to you because it's obviously outside of my experience. And I remember John Bennett talking about his experiences acting as an interpreter, I think with some meetings of the League of Nations, and witnessing the awful destructive effect of people's personal egotism, in that decisions were being made entirely from these personal feelings. which led to enormously destructive results.
Well, when events move very fast, there always is a very great risk, of course, that the people who happen to find themselves in the positions of power are able to take decisions. I mean, they may allow their own whims and interests and fancy ideas to run away with themselves, and with very serious adverse effects. And in my own personal experience, although it's a slightly different kind of way that personal prejudice affects things. I mean, it's the influence of the great Pandit Nehru in relation to Kashmir. I was involved myself in Delhi when the whole Kashmir situation was under initial discussion. I was staying with the then Vice Mountbatten when he was the first Governor General of independent India, only 3 weeks after the transfer of power. And the Lion of Kashmir, the leader of the Kashmiri Muslims, who was a friend of Nehru's, was staying in the house as well. And day by day, people were waiting to see whether the Maharaja of Kashmir and Jammu was going to opt, under the constitutional pattern that we'd foisted onto the Indian princes, that each Indian prince had to decide whether his state opted to be in India or in Pakistan. And the Maharaja of Kashmir, who was a hopeless chap, couldn't make up his mind. He was a Hindu from Jammu, which is quite a small appendage to the very relatively large area of Kashmir, but I mean with a sizable population, and purely Hindu, whereas the valley of Kashmir is almost entirely Muslim.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
Nehru, being of Kashmiri extraction, had a very strong sentimental feeling about Kashmir, and he flatly refused to consider any kind of a compromise position under which some kind of autonomy could have been given to the Muslims of Kashmir, and the whole of this terrible polarization between India and Pakistan over Kashmir might never have been allowed to develop. And that is a matter of individual ancestry and family prejudice.
Yes, prejudice.
Which is slightly different from what you were saying. But again, I mean, in the same way, I mean, in the post-war settlement, I mean, I was sitting as a...
Which war was this? Which war?
The Second World War, at the end of Hitler. I was a very minor official sitting behind the chairs at the Council of Foreign Ministers in London in 1946. And when the peace treaty with Germany and Italy and the satellite countries were being drafted, of course, and everything was determined then by Stalin. And no decision could be reached on any major issue until Stalin condescended to wake up. He was a late riser.
Good God.
And so we used to sit twiddling our thumbs, or rather it didn't sit, we went and drank champagne on the taxpayers' expense at the bar until 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And then Molotov was able to get through to Stalin to get his orders. And everything was determined on those kind of issues in relation to Germany, which meant nothing. Nothing could happen because Stalin wouldn't let it happen. And
so the whole state of post-war Europe was determined through
by Stalin's whims, yes. But then again, I mean, that was rooted in high Russian policy and communist policy, which is slightly different from what you were saying.
Yes. I'm wondering about, we have limited time left, but we touched upon such things as people having accumulated experience and getting, in a sense, the wisdom of accumulated experience. But I think I know I am interested, and I think you are to some degree interested in groups where you get access to a kind of wisdom which doesn't require this accumulated experience of doing things. That is to say, the kind of work which Pat de Mare is concerned with his dialogue process, and Gordon Lawrence with his social dreaming, and possibly many other kinds of groups and ways of working in groups are there. Because I mention these just to make a difference in the conversation. See, here is an attempt to say that there are ways in which groups can come together in which they can access a wisdom not through external study, so to speak, not through actually experience in the field, which can have an influence on what they do.
Well, as you know, I have been enormously impressed myself by the potential of Pat de Mare's median group, where you do have a group of 20 odd, between 15 and 20 and 30, sitting around a table and actually listening to each other, and meeting at regular intervals, weekly or whatever, where you have this in parliamentary subcommittees, for instance, or in international committees, although it's more difficult, then something is generated in the exchange of minds, which is different, which has a certain autonomous action of its own, which creates the mentation of the participants. And so this is a very powerful agent for the future, I think, if it can be harnessed and developed and introduced to a greater extent. And it illustrates that what goes on in the thinking world eventually does determine what happens in the so-called action world.
Doing world, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
that's where the parameters are set.
Yes, and it just strikes me in the way you beautifully describe it that there's, it's really in such groups as you have described that you get effective democracy.
Yes.
On that scale, you can get a living, concrete kind of democracy.
And the House of Lords was, of course, a forum which was able to provide opportunities for this kind of thing in the revision of legislation and the scrutiny of European Union legislation, because you had continuity of membership, you had independence of mind, the participants were not subject to periodical elections, and could exercise their own judgment. But these are rare conditions, of course, in public affairs nowadays.
I discovered just the other day, Francis, I was reading The Life of Simone Weil, and she was quite interested in some of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas. And he had a very practical idea of democracy. He said it won't work as long as you get a reduction to 2 or 3 parties. It cannot possibly work. So what you want are groupings of people which you have like dozens of different, in quotation marks, parties or points of view. Only with an adequate diversity do you get the fabric of a democratic process. If it's reduced to parties, you do not, and you must never pretend to.
Well, I mean, in theory, that is, I'm sure, right. And as a youth, I was very attracted by proportional representation, and for that very reason. But in fact, you have to pay a very, very heavy price, and my judgment, a too heavy a price for that constitution, which makes any kind of decision in a difficult situation extremely difficult to arrive at, other than a very weak compromise. I always let's aim at having understanding of each other's point of view and some kind of compromise. But when you're faced with a very difficult social situation, like breaking the power of the unions in the Thatcher regime, it couldn't have been done with a proportional representation constitution. It could only be done with a big majority behind party majority on the two or three party system.
Yeah, I think when we have this kind of topic about, it has been an amazing thing to me how the Athenians got their act together to defend themselves against the Persians, when they would always argue about everything.
Well, there's nothing like an external threat, of course.
Yes.
And also, let's face it, I mean, that was in many ways an aristocratic society with a high measure of responsible leadership, and such a small society that it was quite easy for the, as it were, the man in the forum to remain in touch with his leaders.
Yeah, to know him personally.
Small city-state. And
so there's a question of scale in this, which I find so fascinating, Francis, about how, as I think people say, you can have some kind of living personal process up to about 2,000 or even maybe just 10,000 people. But you go beyond that and you get into this realm of the impersonal, or the mass, or something else which is rather difficult to describe, because it seems that one goes completely outside of the range of influence of a person. You go to 100,000 people, a person seems to be so small as to be discounted, and then you're into statistics or impersonal forces.
Well, that's why people are voting, non-voting with their feet. I mean, so many young people feel it's no point in voting because it can't have any influence. And they say they don't bother, and this is becoming really quite a danger. But I think there are counter trends of hold out some promise. I mean, the advent of the referendum, which I don't much like myself, as distinct from a parliamentary government, but I mean, the introduction of relatively frequent referenda in some countries does restore some authenticity to the individual vote. And even if you're still only one of millions, you know the outcome is going to be decided by all those one votes in a referendum, which is rather different from the exercise of party power.
Yes, it is usually concerns specific issues. Indeed, the referendum to do with the fate of the nation, so to speak, or the overall. And that's put into my mind that, of course, when you get these more massive groupings, of course, there are many levels. Still, you go up to millions, and then to this country 60, 70 million people, whatever it is, then you're beginning to get a kind of entity. And this is, again, an absolutely burning, for me, it's a burning and difficult issue of global affairs, the problem or the nature of nations, because, of course, people belong to a nation almost as if to belong to an image which embraces them, an image of a history, an image of a people, image of a culture. Like in our country still, however how strong the Republican interests are, the monarchy is integral to the nature of the people, to this, and this land, this monarchy, this religion, and so on, as you know well. And I'd like to see many comments to make upon this, because, of course, the nation as we know it in the modern world I always think of it as being largely kind of driven by Napoleon a couple of 100 years ago, how he unified because of his aggression. Italy became unified, and all the nation states began to define themselves and this sort of thing. But there is a question, and with Nigeria too, and you have in a sense an artificial, synthetic nation. How are all these people brought together into, say, this is we are the people?
Well, this gets you into deep water. I mean, and in different parts of the world, the answers are quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And in Europe, of course, the nation state goes back much further than Napoleon. It goes back to 1648 and Richelieu and all the rest of it.
That's Charlemagne.
Yes, and with its roots in the European forms of tribalism, but I mean, all that takes. But, I mean, what interests me at the moment more than the future of the Western countries, which have got a pattern of their own, which is a fairly firm pattern, even if it may be changing very fast, but is the future of the great Asian nations. And the populations of India and China are so totally disproportionate to the populations of the Western world that as China in particular becomes a great force in international relations through greater economic power, and it's going to take much longer than people tend to think. I mean, they talk loosely as if it would get round the corner. But 20 years isn't very far off, and a lot can happen in the meantime, and hopefully it will happen in the meantime. And India, again, if India could somehow get through its problems, is still to a great extent being shackled by the remnants of sentimental socialism and now the rampant toxic influence of corruption. That I would love to see India becoming a real force in international relations, but I believe that China could potentially become an immensely beneficial force, because the Chinese are such extraordinary people, very disciplined, very hard-working, wonderful history, great culture, although they've done their best to destroy it. And of course, the bee in my bonnet is Falun Gong. I mean, here are 100 million highly motivated, worthwhile people at every level of society, from senior members of the Communist Party before they were chucked out, and senior officers in the army, down to the humblest workers in the factories. And 100 million people, even in a country of 1 billion plus, is an enormous influence potentially, if they're prepared to try to exert it. And as they stand, as you know, for truth, for compassion and for toleration, I mean, this is a marvelous influence in international relations potentially. And I think it could be a very great help to the Western world.
So there is quite a contrast here, because we have nothing that's equivalent happening in the Western nations. It's a notion of actually transforming or reshaping a whole, on what this is, a nation or a people. It's an amazing scale of change involved in this.
Well, as we've wrecked our educational systems in both sides of the Atlantic, maybe we're going to come up with some new kind of form through serious media and the influence of radio, television and networking, and of group work. And who knows, I mean, perhaps we're going to be able to devise from the bottom up a new informal education. That would be hope.
That would be absolutely splendid, certainly from my point of view.
The natural thinkers being the leaders of the process. Hooray!
Then maybe this suggests to me something which has always captivated me from, I'll tell you what the particular incident it was, which affected me a great deal. It's when I was going to Czechoslovakia in 1968, and I talked to Mr. Vedit, and he said, "Oh yes," he said, "the higher powers are making an experiment there." And I thought, wow, this is quite a statement to make. Yeah. It's very interesting to have an interpretation of what was happening, not from a kind of political, social point of view, but from this other perspective. And I thought this is to be taken seriously. And when I went to Czechoslovakia and was talking to just the ordinary people there, and as you know, I just by chance caught the last train out of Prague before the Russians invaded. In fact.
I'd forgotten that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was constantly struck by talking to these people about how to say it happened spontaneously. There was nobody directing it. There was no central kind of revolutionary or reformist agency involved. It just, people started doing this, and that was the constant refrain, and I was incredibly impressed and influenced by that ever since. I thought it genuinely possibly could really happen like this, a kind of synchronous upwelling in which nobody would be in charge, you know. And it was strange how we saw so many moments like that. I don't know how many moments, but a lot of moments like that in all this time period to do with the collapse of the Soviet influence, you know, in Poland, the solidarity, it was spontaneous self-organization which happened there, and which was absolutely, in my mind, miraculous. You know, which achieved astonishing social and political goals within a short span of time.
Of course, one feature of those kind of upwelling of public movement is that it's a reaction to harsh conditions, and another aspect, as I share, as you know, Bennett's, JGB's view on the direct intervention or indirect intervention of invisible higher influences in planetary affairs. I think that we've reduced our own predicament in the planet through our irresponsibility. Such a threat to organic life on the planet that the invisible forces are going to intervene with a surgical operation fairly soon, and to stop it before it stop this toxic human race in its tracks before its irreversible destruction. And I think that's going to happen, and I think we're going to have shock treatment. And when we've had shock treatment, then I hope and believe that the human race spread over the face of the world in its different areas and circumstances will spontaneously somehow regroup in some healthy way and do things that are a sight better than we've been doing in the last 50 years or 100 years. And this is not a view that is commonly shared on a large scale, especially in the media. But
certainly not in the media, but I think a lot of people share that point of view.
It doesn't much matter whether we share it or not. What matters is whether it's true or not, and if it's going to happen.
The two images there. One is of a picture which represents mankind as being sort of childlike, infantile, and so the parents have to come in to clear up the mess which the children got themselves into for their own good, so to speak.
I think that's a fair parallel, yes.
This is the picture. The other is that this thing about shock and so on. I remember Gurdjieff's very powerful interpretation of this. He ascribes these shocks to great nature, and as a matter of the balance of, and here we might crudely translate great nature into Gaia, you know, this divine deep intelligence of life with its accumulated wisdom, because human beings have to produce, and this is a peculiar picture of it, have to produce a certain quality of energy, and if they, you know, which is to do with an authentic inner life and objective morality, that kind of thing. And if this is not done, then great nature arranges it so the shocks, and he then gives this wonderful phrase, shocks unbecoming the three-brain beings will ensue. And you can look at the world going around us, and even September the 11th as being such a shock is actually the fabric of reality. Now when it comes to saying, is this higher powers or not, I say, well, I certainly don't know. Because I have the principle, if there are higher powers, then the way in which they work will not fit my image of the way in which they should work.
Well, it's beyond our perception.
I think so.
And there are scales, I think.
Yes.
So,
but for me, an important, absolutely, say Francis, you've expressed what you believe in. An absolutely irreducible thing for me is this capacity in the ordinary people, this inherent, intense, deep creativity which is there in every individual, capable of coming through at any moment. And that's my sort of passion.
Well, this is a basis for optimism anyway.
Right.